Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.
We are really in a historic moment right now in the conflict in the Middle East. We have seen phase one of the Trump administration brokered peace plan play out. All living hostages that were in Gaza are now released, and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and detainees are released back to Gaza. There still remains a lot to be seen when it comes to phase two and beyond of this peace plan. But to start off the conversation, what do you make of the moment that we're in right now?
Well, listen, I think President Trump deserves a lot of credit for stepping in here, taking advantage of Israel's, consolidating its military gains and, brokering a initial peace agreement. And I think it's very important to get these hostages back. It really puts an end to the October 7th massacre and allows, I think, is going to allow Israel to kind of move on, not move on from that, but move forward from it. There's still a lot of questions to be answered, but we've had the release of Palestinian prisoners. We've had the IDF step back. There's now an opportunity for success for a successful transition away from Hamas in Gaza. Now, a lot of work has to be achieved for that to be successful, but there's at least a start here. And I think President Trump deserves a lot of the credit for leaning into Qatar, leaning into Israel, and leaning into the other Arab partners to get us to this point.
I want to talk about President Trump and what he said and the differences between his language versus Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's language. The night before the hostages were released, Netanyahu said that the campaign is not over and that Israel still faces major security challenges ahead. The following day, though, President Trump, in no uncertain terms, said this war is over. This is a historic moment. It's a historic dawn. It's a new chapter, essentially, in the Middle East. What do you make of that difference in language? Read the tea leaves for us.
So there's two aspects to this. One is every Israeli prime minister, but particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, frames Israel as fighting a seven-front war. Iran, forces in Syria, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, IRGC proxy groups. It's seven total. And he's right. I mean, they've done a lot to weaken Hezbollah. They've done a lot to weaken Hamas. They've done a lot to weaken Iran. But they're still always in conflict with some of these radical Islamic groups. So, they have to maintain a high level readiness. So he's right in the sense that the war is never over. I don't believe it'll be a long time before we say the war is over for Israel in general, or the threat to Israel is over. President Trump was very specifically talking about Gaza. And in that sense, President Trump's right that we had turned a new leaf. Now, President Trump's going to have to stay very involved if he wants phase one to go to phase two, to go to phase three. And I will say historically, that has not been the United States, or particularly President Trump's long suit, to stay engaged on the problem in front of you in foreign policy. So we'll have to see what happens.
The world has really given President Trump credit for bringing this peace deal together. He had a victory lap in the Middle East earlier this week. He was met with such applause, especially when he was in Israel. I do want to read part of the peace declaration he signed along with leaders from Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt. This is what it said in part. Together, we will implement this agreement in a manner that ensures peace, security, stability, and opportunity for all peoples of the region, including both Palestinians and Israelis, and it committed to resolving further disputes, quote, through diplomatic engagement and negotiation rather than through force or protracted conflict. How do they do that?
So we'll see. I mean, it really is going to take a commitment from those same countries to put forces in Gaza to suppress Hamas. Because if they don't, if Hamas is able to strike out and hit Israel in any way, shape, or form, Israel will strike back. Israel believes deterrence not by denial, but deterrence by cost imposition. Or punishment. So if you strike them, their way to stop you from striking them in the future is they strike you back harder. So I would say it is absolutely incumbent, particularly on Qatar and Turkey, and Egypt to ensure that Hamas truly is demobilized, disarmed, and does not have a leadership role in a future Gaza. And if they don't do that, Israel will come back. And I think Netanyahu's made that clear. And I think the president would allow it. He'll be frustrated, but he'd allow it.
To that point, Netanyahu really left the door open. If Hamas doesn't drop their arms, a military campaign could ensue. I mean, what do you think the future of Hamas is? Do you think that they will completely disarm, will cease to exist? Because right now, I mean, they were severely hurt by Israel's military campaign, but they're not completely dead.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, they spent the last 36 hours conducting vengeance attacks on Palestinians they felt weren't sufficiently loyal, executing some, beating others. I mean, they were trying to show who's in charge still. So I don't know that they're committed to disarming and demobilizing. I do think Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey would like them to. So we'll have to see what happens, and we'll have to see how forceful those countries are. If they're not forceful, eventually it will fall on Israel, and I think eventually the United States will support Israel in that. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we can get this, where there's another, either the Palestinian Authority or another group emerges to lead Gaza. Historically, I'm not optimistic.
I know that Israel wants Hamas to completely disarm. The Palestinian people want a two-state solution or their own state. What do you think the chances of a two-state solution are of happening? Because President Trump, he kind of dismissed answering that concretely. He said, we're talking about rebuilding Gaza. I'm not talking about single state or double state or two-state. Do you think the chances of a two-state solution are high?
Only if you will only have a two-state solution if and when Hamas is completely disarmed, demobilized, and does not have a role in Gaza. So to the degree that that happens, then they have a potentiality for that long-term solution. I'll say the same for the rebuilding. Humanitarian assistance will flow no matter what, but the rebuilding will not happen. Countries will not invest in a Gaza ruled by Hamas because they know whatever buildings they built will probably be flattened in a future Israeli counterstrike. Right? You cannot. So the key to the success of phase 2 and phase 3 is the demobilization and disarmament completely of Hamas, and not that it regenerates under another name, but that style of militant, aggressive, attacking behavior is eliminated. If that doesn't happen, you won't have rebuilt Gaza, and you won't have a two-state solution. And I would say probably Prime Minister Netanyahu does not believe it'll happen. I think the president has an aspirational hope that it'll happen. And for the people of Gaza, I do hope it happens.
We've seen before ceasefires in this conflict happen, then fall apart just months or weeks later. This time does feel different. We're at the beginning, though. It does feel different. The world's reaction feels different around this. Do you think it's different, A? And B, I mean, how long lasting do you think this peace will be, especially considering Israel didn't go to Egypt, Hamas leaders were not in Egypt for that peace signing?
I do think this has the highest opportunity for success over the last 2 years. That's for certain. Maybe over the last decade. But it's still, this will be a challenge, and it really is. The key players in this are not Israel and the United States. The key players in this are those, supposedly moderate Arab states, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, that they truly turn on Hamas, because some of them have, certainly Turkey supported Hamas, and I think some degree Qatar has in the past too, and turn on Hamas, crush them internally inside Palestine politically, and allow for the growth of another legitimate leadership organization for Gaza.
And let's say there is another leadership organization. What are the chances that that's not Hamas-esque or a different leadership organization that is similar to Hamas, just under a different name?
Well, if it is Hamas under a different name, I don't think the Israelis will accept it. If it's similar or, slightly related, that'll become a tricky political issue for Israel. But if it acts like Hamas, it will be crushed. It will be treated like Hamas, and it will be crushed. And it should be. Look, Israel can't accept a aggressive, attacking terrorist organization running a rump state right alongside it. That's just not acceptable. We wouldn't accept it. No democracy would accept it in that kind of condition. And so I think eventually we would understand why Israel would have to crush it. So let's hope that doesn't happen. But that really is up to Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, not the United States and Israel.
And the world is watching right now, but there's still a lot that remains to be seen, questions that remain to be answered as we head into phase 2 and beyond. What signposts specifically are you looking out for to kind of see where we're going next?
The level of security forces would be a good sign. What's really committed? What's their rules of engagement? How aggressive are they in policing issues? How do they invest in a new leadership, regime in Gaza? And then finally, what kind of money do they put in? Because these countries, the moderate Arab states, and this now would include Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others, are not going to put their money into a state they know is going to fail again, right? They're not that bad of businessmen. They're smart businessmen. They won't make that investment. So if you don't see the money, and you don't see the security forces, and you don't see the political effort, you're not going to see success.
I do now want to turn to a different conflict that you and I have talked about at length, and that is the war between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think a peace deal here in the Middle East means anything for that conflict? Because Ukrainian President Zelensky, he said that the peace deal, quote, brings more hope for peace in other regions where life is still under threat. What do you make of that?
So, I think what he hopes is that President Trump puts the same level of attention to the Russia-Ukraine problem and the same amount of pressure on the true belligerent. And in the case in the Middle East, it was Hamas. In the case of Eastern Europe, it's Russia. So from Zelensky's point of view, the lesson learned from this would be that President Trump goes and puts real pressure on President Putin and Russia. And therefore that gives him, that gives Zelensky some optimism. We'll have to see.
And what specifically are you looking out for that conflict? Because you were in Ukraine recently. What was your experience on the ground like? And what do you think that the world needs to know about this conflict that perhaps isn't in the international conversation?
So you're right. I just finished a couple of weeks there, and it wasn't significantly different than 4 months ago when I was there. I still don't see any cracks in Ukrainian societal resilience. I see their forces, their ground forces getting smarter, and their air forces really developing. But I did see a lot more attacks by Putin and Russia, particularly drone and cruise missile attacks. The last night I was there was an all-out strike on Kiev's electrical power grid that took down power through a lot of the city. I would say that war is maintaining at a pretty high level, both ground and missile attacks. But I do not see Ukraine losing, and I don't see how Ukraine can reoccupy new, Crimea or territory they've lost, but I don't see them losing much more on the battlefield, and they don't see them collapsing against the Russian threat.
And in recent months, President Trump met with Zelensky. He met with Putin. He's been trying to broker peace between the two. What do you want to see from the Trump administration and President Trump specifically?
So he needs to bring pressure on Putin. And the first thing is sanctions. We've discussed this before. Sanctions on the countries that receive fossil fuels, oil and natural gas through the shadow fleet. That's China, India, and Turkey. President Trump, for other reasons, has selectively targeted tariffs on India, but he needs to do it on China and Turkey so that both those countries and India stop receiving that fuel. If they stop receiving that shadow fleet oil, natural gas, that's going to put a serious limitation on Putin's ability to conduct this war. He gets 40% of his external, of his exports, of his funding for the government from fossil fuels. And of that money, he then spends 40% of the federal budget on the military, on the war. So you can really bring pressure on him. The second one I would do is, I know President Zelensky really wants tomahawks. I've used tomahawks a lot in my career. I'm not opposed to tomahawks, but it's really, those will be low numbers. What we really need to do is make sure we're providing them a weapon called the extended range attack munition, or ERAM. I believe we can get them 2,000 to 3,000 over the next 2 years. This is a long-range, low-cost cruise missile that can just hammer Russian forces, hold them accountable for what they're doing, impose cost on them when they try to attack, in a way that the Ukrainians have not been able to do with their own limited long-range strike and such. So from my point of view, give them the right weapons. And we also need to give them defensive weapons. This is the air defense weapons like Patriot and AMRAAM missiles. Give them the defensive weapons, the offensive weapons, do the sanctions. If we bring all three of those together, Putin at some point's got to decide this is not, he's got what he's got, and he needs to, quote, declare victory and at least get a temporary ceasefire for now. And in that temporary ceasefire, we can continue to strengthen Ukraine and make Putin's long-term goals unexecutable.
I know you said at some point Putin needs to stop. When do you think that point is going to be realistically?
My thought process is that he's going to try one more summer offensive next summer. So I think realistically, this war, stretches on to next September, October. Now, to be honest, to be frank, I can't assess Russian societal resilience. I'm not allowed to travel there, and I don't want to travel there. But if that were to collapse, then it would be earlier. But if Russian societal resilience stays strong or as is, I think it's late next summer is when Putin realizes this is an unwinnable war for him.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for, whether it be in the Middle East or Russia's war in Ukraine. And I always appreciate our conversations and you providing your insight. And I hope as we see these developments continue, you can come back on and break them down. Admiral Montgomery, thank you so much for the time. I'm already looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.